The 2020s feels like one big game show. Guess what's going to happen next? You might get hit with a pandemic. You might get hit with this. You might get hit with that. And a lot of you watching who are younger, the pandemic is your version of 9/11. It's your version of World War II. There's a growing trend on YouTube where people like to say life hasn't been the same since 2020. I want to take it further than that. I feel like the 2000s from the jump was one big shit show. 2001 to me was like the start of everything. 2020 was just icing on the cake. Welcome back to the channel. This is Can I Be Ernest? For those of you who are new to the channel, when I'm not making videos of interest, I'm usually doing social commentary. Why, you ask? Because everyone else does. But I want to touch briefly on the presidential election, in particular Donald Trump, and why he is so vilified while adored at the same time. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this, at least within the last 40 years, where a president or a presidential candidate was hated and loved simultaneously. And after Trump recently went through a second assassination attempt, it led me to wondering, when was the last time we've seen a president or a president-to-be in such dire straits? So for all my history buffs, if you go back 40 plus years ago, we all know that Ronald Reagan was the last president that was hit. Presidents are threatened daily. They are briefed regularly about potential threats, but usually it's not made public. Usually they're not hit. The Secret Service, those in law enforcement are quick on the job. But why is Trump so vilified? And why is he so loved? Think about our timeline for those of you who are over 35, maybe 40. Think about the last 25, 30 years. When have you ever seen anything like this? A presidential candidate experiencing multiple assassination attempts. It hasn't happened. So it's starting to feel a little scary, a little spooky. And it's not because Halloween's around the corner. It's starting to feel like the 60s. And I wasn't here during the 60s, but when you think about it politically, with the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, then JFK, then Martin Luther King, we lost some prominent names in that era. And now we're in the era, the 2020s, to me, will be remembered as the eggshell era. We're walking on eggshells. You just don't know what's going to happen next. Think about the 60s with the assassination attempts and the whole man on the moon thing, which, you know, we'll get into that in another video. But the idea that could have happened, a lot happened in that decade. And in the 2020s, we start the whole decade off with the pandemic. When I think about Donald Trump, is it the radical left that's really looking to take him out? Or is it just some weirdo out here hoping to put their name in the history books? Or is it both? Maybe I've been under a rock all this time, but from 2016, the time he was elected, to 2020, was it really that bad when you think about it? Is there a group out here really hoping to not have this guy serve another 4 years? Was 2016 to 2020 that bad? Because I don't think so. I think over the course of the last 40 years, we've had worse scenarios. Think about the early 80s with the war on drugs. We had a stock market crash in the mid to late 80s. Early 90s, we start the decade off with the Gulf War. Then after that, things were pretty cool on the home front. The economy started to, flourish. And in the latter 90s, we had the Y2K anxieties and into the 2000s. And then 2001, we start off with 9/11. And for a whole decade, it was just misery. From anthrax threats to terror threats to anytime you turn on your television, the terror threats were either yellow, orange, or red. We had military at our airports and at our subway stations. It felt like a military state. It just felt scary. Like at any moment, we were going to get struck by some country. It just felt like at any moment we were going to get struck. It was going to turn into one big game of Call of Duty. But it was miserable throughout the 2000s for the most part, from a political standpoint. But think about the presidents we've had. since then. So with the war on drugs, it was the Ronald Reagan era, into the George H.W. Bush era. Then into the 90s, we have Bill Clinton. Even in the year 2000, when George W. Bush pretty much stole the election from Al Gore, people were outraged, but it wasn't the hatred for a president that Donald Trump faces. I remember the day George W. Bush was in his limo with his wife heading towards the White House. And guess what people were doing? They were protesting, but guess how they protested? They were throwing eggs at his limo. Eggs. No bullets. As angry as people were by the outcome, no one attempted to take his life. And then when George W. Bush faced a attack, it was a shoe being thrown at him. A shoe. No bullets. Now, it could have been a hard bottom, and if the hard bottom would have cracked his cranium, it could have been a different story. But the bottom line is, a shoe was thrown at him, and he had the wherewithal to duck, and his limo was hit with eggs years prior. Again, no bullets. So what is it about Donald Trump that make people want to take him out? Why do people create this narrative that he's the next Hitler? Do people not know their history books? Do people think that if he's elected, that these next 4 years are going to be Hitler-like? I don't know if people really understand the dynamics. Did any one of you feel like 2016 to 2020 was the lowest point in your lives in history? Because many people thrived during his presidency. That's not talked about enough. Those who didn't thrive, was it as bad as the war on drugs of the 80s? Was it as bad as the stock market crashes within the last 40 years? Was it as bad as the housing crisis in the late 2000s? These events all happened under different presidents who didn't face having their lives taken away from them. That's where I'm concerned. What did Trump do in 2016 through 2020 to make people say, you know what? He's got to go by any means. Now, as somebody who was born in New York, I do recall Trump being a popular figure. He rubbed elbows with many in pop culture. He was not hated as much as he's hated now. He was just not. People used his name in rap lyrics. The idea was to be Donald Trump, to make money like Donald Trump. If you were like a rapper, he was always used metaphorically. So for him to be so despised now is odd to me. Where again, this man's life was on the line on two separate occasions within months of each other. Some very interesting times we're living in, but the 2020s, in my opinion, will be remembered as the unpredictable era. There's just no sense of comfortability, in my opinion. Of course, you have plenty of people out here living their lives to the fullest and they have no worries. They take one day at a time and they can ignore some of the things happening. But those of us who can't ignore, those of us who can see things straight and plain, it's even gloomy today. Even when it rains, it feels like it's off. Something's off with the world. And rain is isolated. Last summer or 2 summers ago on the East Coast, we had the whole orange sky thing where they said it was due to the wildfires in Canada. So the sky was just orange, and you just don't know what you're facing in 2020 and beyond. Because we start the decade off with a pandemic, and then we have all sorts of things. All sorts of things. They're finally disclosing the UFO stuff. There's assassination attempts. There's this, there's that. This unrest. There's just a whole lot of unrest in this decade. And maybe that was by design. But I'm wondering now, how important is the presidency in 2024 as opposed to 50, 60, 70 years ago? Because if they're telling us that presidents are already selected long before they're in office, then what are we getting worked up about? Why are the news channels just so riled up on painting narratives? CNN is pro-left wing, Fox News is pro-right wing. Why are people getting so up in arms if all this is just entertainment? Should we be this concerned about these next 50 days or less, if everything's already planned, what are we worried about? It's out of our control, so the vote doesn't matter. I just wish somebody of authority could come out and say, hey, listen, guys, voting doesn't count. Voting doesn't matter. That way the public can universally be on the same page. No more fighting, no more pitting this group against that group, this, that, and the third. No more of that. But they won't do that. So we're just in some interesting times, and these next 40 plus days to the election are going to be very, very entertaining. Get your popcorn ready. And if you don't have your passport, I would advise you get your passport. I just don't feel good about things either way. And I'm just curious to see what happens. But I'd be remiss to not acknowledge, as much as Trump is vilified, he is adored. When's the last time you saw a presidential candidate or a president with flags and merchandise? Hats and t-shirts and flags on the front lawns and on rooftops and in back of cars. Trump's the only president that I've ever seen with this much support. I don't recall seeing Obama flags being waved on front porches. I don't recall seeing George W. Bush flags, Bill Clinton flags, Ronald Reagan flags. You may have seen bumper stickers driving around, but I've never seen the support for a guy who only served one term. Never seen it before. But again, there are so many people that want this guy out of here. So just weird times. And I don't know if he can serve 2 terms this go around, since he already served 1 term. Maybe somebody who's watching can enlighten me, but I don't think Trump can serve 2 terms this go around if he wins in November. Besides, he'd be in his 80s by that point, and it probably wouldn't make sense to keep putting in 80-year-olds or keeping the 80-year-olds in office. But yeah, just something that's been on my mind. Never seen anyone loved and hated like this before. I mean, maybe Obama, for obvious reasons, he was hated, but I don't know if everyone loved him. Trump is getting support from blacks. Trump's getting support from the obvious, his longtime supporters, those who live in certain parts of the country. He's getting wide support, while also walking around here having to, bulletproof his whole body, because there's just so many nut jobs out here looking to make a name for themselves. So again, get your popcorn ready, get your passports ready.